before we go further, a few comments on the last question and also on the title. Okay, where does the title come in from? The title, How Sweet It Will Be to Die, is actually a factual statement Freud said to Jung.
Hmm.
They were having a get together, some discussion, and then everyone started moving out of the room. Freud and Jung were together, and Freud had one of his fits and he collapsed. And when Jung helped him to rise up, before he could actually rise up, the moment Freud regained his consciousness, in almost a half-aware state, he said, "How sweet it will be to die." That tells us that his mind essentially was in deep turmoil. And he was not ready to accept, as Jung did, that Jung used to say, there is a demon in me and it overpowers me.
Mm-hmm.
I discovered something which others don't know. So when I see that in front of me, I rush towards it. I know where I am going, but others only see a fool rushing ahead. Because they can't see the goal towards which I am rushing. So Freud would not agree with that, but there was a part of him which was overpowering him. That happens in every genius. That they are destined to something, and there's a part of their unconscious, it overpowers them and propels them into a particular area with such force and such productivity that they end up creating what they create. So that is true of all great scientists, philosophers.
Mm.
That was true for, but he's essentially mind in turmoil. Now, when you combine his turmoil with his pessimism and his
Mm.
difficulty of sustaining long-term relationships
Mm.
outside of his marriage, um, you get a mind which is so in turmoil, almost in pain, almost a mind where death instinct is quite strong and gives a lot of pain. And therefore, uh, death then seems to be sweet and peaceful. And a similar kind of thing we see many times in patients who are deeply depressed, who are prescribed ECT. And before the ECT, when they are given the injections just to go into an anesthetic state, there comes a state when they are very relaxed. And many patients tell me that I wish I could go into that state without the ECT. And many times I tell the psychiatrist that you give me this injection, this anesthetic or tranquilizer, whatever you are giving me, don't give me the ECT, but just allow me to be in that relaxed, peaceful, blissful state. It's almost a state of delightful meditation.
In fact, I'm reminded of in one of my little surgeries where I was under the general anesthesia. There was, though I don't have much of turmoil in my head, sometimes but when I experienced the unconscious state and when I was coming back to my consciousness, there was a realization of the struggle of life.
Correct.
And exactly these were my words कि wow इतना मीठा लग रहा था सब कुछ and all of a sudden this is like oh my god where I have come. So that tranquilized state or probably where your mind is not at work
So it is
is
a
a
state,
very very rested place.
and it's a place between uh, inertia, the unconscious on one side, and the awake state on the other. It's an in-between transitional state, which is a very
Yes,
relaxed and a blissful state.
it is. It is.
So no
It's a
wonder
sweet place. Exactly, that is the word I had used.
sweet,
Sweet.
sweet place.
It is not a painful or a dead inertia.
No, no.
It is
It's
a
a
blissful.
restful place, a sweet place. It's a place of sweet rest. It's a place of relaxation. It's a place of freshness.
Even there's no sensation of relaxation. There's this disconnection from the physicality, the five senses. So there is no input happening.
That is one state. And just before it, before the input goes down, you can pass through that state of relaxation and bliss. So those states, they are in between zones between the conscious on one side and the conscious on one side.
And
This transitional states, you often also can experience it if you undergo hypnotherapy, because they put you in a trance, and the trance often can lead you to experience of these states. What happens in hypnotherapy is second part, but the trance definitely is very restful.
somehow I don't know if it is to be compared or not, but yes, for me, even I have experienced this silence and relaxation in trance, but the of being knocked out, unconscious, was extremely different. There was like, why I'm alive, why I've come back again. It is that relaxing.
Correct.
It is not like a trance. It is much more deeper than that.
Correct. So Freud had that turmoil, and we often see that when you don't take rest and you think very hard for a very long time, you often see the cases of prostate cancer.
Sure.
Freud had actually that ultimately, apart from the oral cancers, which was because of his smoking. And it's an interesting point to note that he would analyze everything about everybody. And when somebody asked him that what is the psychoanalytic meaning of the cigar that you keep smoking all the time, we all know what it would mean. So Freud said, at times, cigar is only a cigar. And the second important thing about, very interesting part about Freud was, one wit once wrote to him saying, we have heard that you are narcissistic, despotic, autocratic, masochistic, and a disaster as a leader. As a world's leading psychologist, what is your opinion on yourself?
Oh my God.
So Freud wrote back saying, when it comes to myself, I don't trust my opinion.
That's a genius speaking.
Yeah. So that is one part of the title, that how sweet it will be to die. It tells us how tormented his mind was and through what pain psychoanalysis got created. This immense pain at a personal level experienced by Freud, immense difficulty, not to mention his health difficulties and financial difficulties. Unlike Jung, he passed through great financial difficulties. And through all of it, he navigated through all those turbulent oceans, the ship of psychoanalysis. So the genius part of it. One can also say from Eastern point of view that the hostile forces which were working in the unconscious completely free. Now Freud had broken open some explanations, and they could no longer work with impunity, and no wonder they would have exacted a revenge. So all of that about Freud. Coming to his second part of Waltonschong, he has been largely accepted by media studies, film studies, less by management, less by economics, and that is where the difficulty also comes in. That the idea of the rational man is what is one of the limitations of all these sciences.
Absolutely.
The idea of the conscious man and the rational man, they are the severe limitations of entire humanities and social sciences based upon behaviorism and empiricism, which has been the main current of last 50 years. So
50
I think now we will go into the non-rational part of the man and slowly look at the real picture rather than the artificial academic picture. One more element, as we discussed, was of back to Freud. So every 20 years, we see a back to Freud movement for the simple reason there are some eternal truths. And if we read Freud even today, which we are going to read in coming months, we find how true and significant and deep his work is. Not that it is completely true or it is comprehensive, not that it does not have his biases, but all those limitations discounted, some eternal truths still are the foundation of psychoanalysis. And therefore, we see in Lacan a clear movement of back to Freud. And I will not be surprised if we see back to Freud again in a couple of decades. As far as my own heat model is concerned, many parts of Freudian theory are there to explain the processes. The idea of the unconscious, the idea of significance of dreams, idea of unconscious leaking out through hypnosis, through art, through free association, through sleeps, and through everyday pathologies. The idea of the psychoanalytic frame and interpretation, the idea of transference, counter-transference, projective identification, the idea of destruction of self and the other, the idea of guilt and guilt pathology, all of them are still there. What one can add are other things, that one can bring in a more sophisticated model of the mind. One can add the superego happiness and superego strength. One can add the collective unconscious and maybe some archetypes. One can add what Klein has found later on, Kohut has found later on. So all those can be added, but into itself, though not all true and all comprehensive, there is a component of eternally true things in Freud's work. So that is how back to Freud always happens and will keep happening, regardless of how much people keep rejecting. And one of the reasons of rejection is not only the unconscious resistance, it's also the difficulty of understanding Freud. Unlike other areas like CBT, which can be easily understood and learned, it takes years to understand and learn Freud. That also is a holdback for popularity of Freud. Of course, Freud has its own limitations, and we'll see in a moment, but that is why back to Freud movement happens. And I would say, like Nietzsche and Schopenhauer, people don't give adequate credit to Freud, even while using his concepts knowingly or unknowingly. And so I would say it's a question of being ungrateful and unethical on that point.
So of being spending more than 2.5 decades with psychoanalysis and journeying on to all these concepts, how would you reflect upon Freud?
I would reflect upon him as a eternal genius, that part of his work is eternal for all times to come, that our thinking and our worldview is no longer as it would be if Freud had not lived. So it is what it is because Freud lived. There is no doubt about it. He actually created a science which was one of the most difficult to create. It's almost like Galileo trying to prove concepts
Into the universe.
fundamentally opposed Christian world. So similarly, he was trying to found a science that was opposed by the world. And this is very different from being an Einstein. Einstein would face opposition only from the scientific community, not from world in general. This would face opposition from the world in general. So this is how he was. Now, the difficult parts about him was his fanatic adherence to materialism, his own pessimism and masochism, his own autocracy and dictatorial nature, and his own inability to really resolve his issues at their roots. So he could resolve his issues substantially, but many of them not at their roots. He was actually living what Lacan would have called a syntheon. that symptom has been reduced by a great intensity, and the rest of it is so deeply understood that the symptom no longer causes suffering, or at least causes minimum suffering. So he had that type of a life, and he did not have any opening for the East,
Mm.
and he was a product of the Western civilization completely. He was a product of he and psychoanalysis both. So if psychoanalysis was a product of Freud, Freud was a product of modernity. Modernity itself is a on the line
Product.
product of the Abrahamical thinking, which itself is a product of singularism. So that singularism always came into Freud. It's a ceaseless tradition of 5,000 years in the Western civilization. And that singularism would always get him into an or situation rather than an and situation. So either you are with me or you're against me. There was no confluence, there was no middle ground. So either you are my Prince Charming or you are my enemy. And this was the difficulty. Another difficulty had to do with the model of the mind. That the model of the mind and the two forces model of Eros and Thanatos, they were not made compatible. The structural component and the functional component could not actually be brought together.
Yeah, they sound very distinct and totally different.
Disjointed. The early Freud and later Freud disjointed. You don't have a confluence or synergy between the two. So that was a very severe limitation. The other limitation had to do with working with psychotics and children directly. Because a large component of Freud's patients actually were neurotics, were adults. Contrast to Jung and Klein's patients, where both of them had quite some psychotics, and Klein had large number of children. Winnicott had large number of children. And therefore, what they found was different. Not that Freud was wrong, but they found something different. And Freud's
large number of children, as in their own offsprings you're talking about?
Yes, patients.
Or the patients. Okay. Because Freud was also having a lot of children.
Yeah.
So you're talking about the patients.
So Freud's learning about children substantially came from his own raising of his own children.
True.
Because he had many children. And Freud's idea of a
Kleinians and Jung.
Sorry?
Now I'm clear. I was getting confused. Children as in the patients you're talking about.
And therefore, Freud's idea of a child is of a micro man. It's a miniaturized version of man. As though man comes completely built by birth or is genetically made automatically in the course of expression of genes. But there are no ifs and buts, no complexities in manufacturing of that micro man. Whereas when you go to Klein and Winnicott and Kohut, we see that the micro man making itself is a complex process. So what that led to was Freud's work was very good for Oedipal pathologies. But Freud's work was not good enough for narcissistic pathologies, pre-Oedipal pathologies, or post-Oedipal difficulties. Say, for example, the midlife or moving towards death or repeated disappointments leading to resignation. Those were not the areas that Freud's theory was very powerful at. It's not even today. And therefore, Freud's idea of a man came from regressed adults rather than children directly. And that created this idea of child being a micro man. Whereas we see that when you go into the pre-Oedipal dynamics of how the ego is formed or the self is formed, or how the split position leads to internalization or non-internalization of good, reliable, stable objects, and how that becomes then the nucleus of adult pathology, or how children develop very early a secure self or a non-secure self, how there are forces of fusion and individuation, as Mahler pointed out. All these were away, not to mention reincarnation, psychedelics, um, the entire zone of East in terms of the tools and conceptual apparatus. All those were not in Freud. So he's definitely incomplete. He's definitely wrong on many points. Say, for example, the generation of, say, depression. His idea of depression was it is related to loss of narcissistically cathected, ambivalently cathected narcissistic object. Ambivalently cathected narcissistic object. So the relationship is narcissistic. It is not an ordinary relationship. And there is a huge loading of affect onto that object, and it is ambivalent. You have love and anger towards the same person. And when that person is lost, substitution is not possible because of the narcissistic relationship and because of the amount of affect involved and the role the person was playing. And when that leaves a vacuum with affect going towards nothing, and the vacuum being unbearable, the only way mourning is not possible with such intense affect. So when substitution is not possible and mourning is not possible, the only way left is denial. And if the person is not psychotic and is neurotic, healthy enough neurotic, the only way denial can be done in a sophisticated way by taking that person in and making it one's own. And in that process, the anger and love towards the person would now turn back on oneself. This anger turned on oneself would lead to depression. Now, this would be one explanation. Clients' explanation would be different.
The explanation you just gave got me in touch with the previous question where you mentioned that most of his students and co-workers would, go through the loss, and this is that narcissistic,
Correct.
omnipotent,
Very well
relationship
pointed out.
with ambivalence.
Very well pointed out.
Yes.
That most of his disciples had this kind of a dynamic with him.
Yes.
And in that dynamic, the anger towards him was not only anger generated in interaction, but also anger from towards their parents transferred onto him. And love,
Also the envy.
also the envy,
Envy.
intense
Yes.
envy. Yeah, and also the love towards the parents transferred onto him and then being let down in that love. So all those dynamics were there with Freud. And now Klein would have a different explanation for depression. Cohut would have a different explanation. Winnicott would have a different explanation. ISTDP would have a different explanation. Now this sticking to only one is one of the typical Freudian problems.
Yes.
You see something in an or situation, not an and situation. And if 100 patients come depressed, maybe 20 are out of Freudian dynamic, 20 are out of Jungian dynamic, and so on. 10 are out of ISTDP and maybe other reasons. So now we know, okay, there is a sadness-led depression, anger-led depression, guilt-led depression, a stressor-led depression, and inwardly endogenous depression. So when you reflect upon all of that, you see the limitations of Freud, but the genius of his remains unparalleled. And I don't think after Freud we had another Freud. We have never had another Freud after Freud. And so much of what we know, think, believe, and heal ourselves and others is because Freud lived.
I remember while reading one of the Freud's book and watching some Netflix series on Freud, I had fallen for him. That is the power of.
So truly, he is a father of psychoanalysis.
Indeed. The coming episodes with Freud's seminal work collection of his writings titled New Introductory Lectures in Psychoanalysis. Every episode, we will cover the work chapter by chapter. Let's hope for the best to come. See you all. See you again. Namaste.
Namaste.